The radio crackled with static over the Hindu Kush mountains at 3:47 hours, and then nothing. Command waited. The silence stretched like a wire pulled too tight, threatening to snap. Somewhere in the darkness between Pakistan and Afghanistan, a CH-53E Super Stallion carrying 12 Marines and 2 crew had simply vanished from radar. The last transmission was garbled, distorted by terrain and interference, but 3 words came through clean enough to freeze everyone in the operations center: taking fire, going, then silence. The kind that swallows everything. Major Catherine Voss stood in the back of the Tactical Operations Center at Bagram Airfield, her arms crossed, watching the screens with eyes that had seen this movie before. She was 34, lean and sun-worn, with dark blonde hair pulled back tight and a face that gave nothing away. They called her Yukon behind her back, sometimes to her face. Not because she was cold, though some thought that too, but because she'd grown up in a town of 800 people outside Fairbanks, Alaska, where the winter dark lasted 20 hours a day, and you learned early that survival meant keeping your mouth shut and your eyes open. She'd been flying Ospreys for 6 years, Cobras before that, 2 deployments to Iraq, 3 to Afghanistan. She had a Navy Cross in a box somewhere that she never talked about, and a scar across her collarbone from a hard landing outside Fallujah that she talked about even less. The men respected her in the way they respected a piece of equipment that always worked: necessary, reliable, forgettable. She wasn't one of them, not really. She was good, maybe great, but she was quiet about it. And quiet didn't make legends in a community that thrived on swagger and call signs earned through outrageous acts of either bravery or stupidity. The operations officer, a lieutenant colonel named Briggs with a voice like gravel in a blender, turned from the console. "We've got a bird down somewhere in the Korangal Valley. Last known position puts them near the ridgeline about 8 clicks northwest of Restrepo." He paused, scanning the room. "It's bad terrain. Worst in theater. Taliban owns those mountains at night." Nobody moved. The Korangal was a meat grinder, a place where helicopters went to die. Steep valleys, narrow approaches, enemy fighters who knew every cave and tree line. Launching a rescue in daylight was dangerous. Launching one in the dark was suicidal. Briggs looked at Voss. "Yukon, you're up. Get a crew together. Wheels up in 20. She nodded once, turned, and walked out into the cold Afghan night without a word. The thing about Catherine Voss that nobody understood was that she'd already died once. Not literally, though she'd come close enough to taste it, but the version of herself that had left Alaska at 18, the girl who'd believed the world was bigger and better than the frozen silence of her childhood, that version had died somewhere over the Euphrates River on a night much like this one. What came back was something else, something quieter. Something that understood survival wasn't about being the loudest or the fastest or the most decorated. It was about showing up when everyone else had already started writing the obituaries. She found her crew chief, a stocky Texan named Ramos, already prepping their V-22 Osprey on the flight line. He didn't ask questions, just handed her the pre-flight checklist and started loading extra ammunition. They'd flown together long enough that words were optional. He knew how she worked. Methodical, thorough, never rushed. She walked the bird's perimeter with a flashlight, checking control surfaces, inspecting the engines, looking for anything that might fail at the worst possible moment. The co-pilot was new, a lieutenant named Katsaros, fresh from flight school, eager and terrified in equal measure. He tried to hide it, but Voss could see it in the way his hands moved too quickly over the switches during pre-flight, the way his eyes kept darting to the darkness beyond the airfield lights. "You good?" she asked, settling into the left seat and pulling on her helmet. Her voice over the intercom was calm, almost flat. Katsaros nodded too quickly. "Yes, ma'am. Good to go." She didn't believe him, but she also didn't have time to hold his hand. "Radio discipline. Keep the chatter minimal. When we get on station, I'll handle the approach. You manage systems and keep your head on a swivel. We're going into a box canyon at night with no moon and an unknown enemy situation. There's no room for mistakes." The Osprey's twin Rolls-Royce turboshaft engine spooled up with a rising whine that rattled teeth and shook the airframe. Voss ran through the startup sequence with the precision of a surgeon, her hands moving across the controls in a practice dance. The nacelles were in helicopter mode, rotors tilted vertical for takeoff. She pulled collective, and the big machine shuddered, lifted, and climbed into the black Afghan sky. 15 minutes into the flight, Briggs's voice came over the secure channel. "Yukon, be advised. We've established contact with the downed crew. They're alive but taking sporadic fire. Casualties unknown. LZ is hot." Voss keyed the mic. "Copy, ETA 12 minutes." Beside her, Katsaros shifted in his seat. She could feel his anxiety like heat radiating off metal. "How do you want to play this, ma'am?" She was quiet for a moment, eyes scanning the horizon where mountains rose like broken teeth against a starless sky. "We go in fast and low, one pass. If it's too hot, we wave off and call for a pash. If there's a window, we take it. Ramos will man the ramp gun. You keep us out of the rocks." The Korangal Valley appeared below them like a black wound in the earth. The valley floor was invisible in the darkness, swallowed by layers of shadow that seemed to move and breathe. Voss transitioned the nacelles forward, pushing the Osprey into airplane mode to gain speed. They dropped to 200 feet above ground level, following the terrain with instruments alone. The radar altimeter ticked down in her peripheral vision, a constant reminder of how little room for error existed between them and the mountains. "Yukon, this is Sabre 16, a voice crackled over the radio, strained and tight. It was the downed pilot, Coulson Ironclad. "We're 2 clicks south of our last reported position. Valley runs east-west. We've got 6 wounded, 2 critical. Taliban fighters approximately 300 meters north and closing. They know we're here." Voss's voice remained unchanged. "Copy, Ironclad. Visual on your position in 90 seconds. Pop infrared strobes on my mark." She pulled the Osprey into a hard bank, carving through the air with a grace that seemed impossible for something so large. Katsaros gripped his armrest but said nothing. Below them, tracers arced across the darkness, green and red threads stitching the night. Someone was firing, and they were firing at the downed crew. "Stand by for gun run," Voss said calmly, as if discussing the weather. She rolled the Osprey toward the source of the tracers, and Ramos opened up with the M240 machine gun mounted on the rear ramp. The weapon roared, sending streams of red tracers downrange. The enemy fire stopped, but Voss knew it wouldn't last. They'd displaced, repositioned. They'd be back. She brought the Osprey around in a wide arc, transitioning back to helicopter mode. The rotors tilted vertical, and the aircraft decelerated hard, hanging in the air like a predator choosing its moment to strike. "Mark," she said. Below, 3 infrared strobes blinked to life, visible only through night vision goggles. The survivors were clustered near the wreckage of their super stallion, which lay crumpled against a ridgeline like a broken toy. "I see them," Katsaros said, his voice higher than before. "Jesus, they're right on top of the crash site. There's no clear LZ." Voss didn't respond. She was already calculating angles, distances, rotor clearance. The crash site was on a slope, surrounded by boulders and scrub vegetation. There was a flat spot about 50 meters downhill, barely large enough for the Osprey's footprint. It would have to be enough. The aircraft descended through layers of darkness, and Voss felt the familiar compression of time that happened in moments like this. Everything slowed and sharpened. She could hear Ramos breathing over the intercom, steady and controlled. She could feel the Osprey's weight shifting as they dropped, the way the controls responded to her inputs with a precision that came from thousands of hours in the cockpit. And she could sense more than see, the mountains rising on either side like walls closing in. At 50 feet, tracers erupted from the ridgeline. Green streaks cut through the darkness, passing close enough that Voss could see them reflected in the canopy. "Contact right," Katsaros shouted, his composure cracking. Ramos swung the gun around and returned fire, but the enemy was dug in, using the terrain for cover. More tracers joined the first, converging on the Osprey from multiple directions. They were in a kill box. Voss made a decision. She didn't abort. She didn't pull up. Instead, she pushed the Osprey forward, angling toward the LZ with a determination that bordered on reckless. The aircraft shuddered as rounds impacted the fuselage, punching through aluminum and composite. Warning lights illuminated the cockpit in red and amber, but her hands never wavered on the controls. At 20 feet, she flared hard, bleeding off speed. The Osprey settled onto the rocky slope with a crunch that Voss felt through the airframe. "We're down," Ramos yelled. "Go, go, go." The Marines from the downed helicopter materialized out of the darkness, carrying their wounded. Voss could see them through the cockpit glass, moving in pairs, weapons up, scanning for threats. They loaded the casualties first, dragging and lifting broken bodies into the Osprey's cargo bay. Blood smeared across the metal deck. Someone was screaming, a high, thin sound that cut through the rotor noise. Katsaros was pale, his eyes wide. We need to go right now." "Not yet," Voss said. She was counting heads, matching the number against what Ironclad had reported. 12 Marines, 2 crew, 14 total. She counted 11. Ramos sitrep. "Still loading," he shouted back. 3 more coming." The ridgeline erupted in muzzle flashes. RPK machine gun fire raked the slope, kicking up dirt and stone. One round punched through the Osprey's tail boom with a metallic shriek. Another shattered a cargo door window. Voss felt the aircraft shudder as something vital took a hit. The number 2 engine fire warning light blinked on. She silenced it with a switch, buying time. The last 3 Marines appeared, 2 of them carrying a third between them. The wounded man's leg was gone below the knee, tourniqueted with a belt. His face was white as paper. They hauled him up the ramp and Ramos slapped the bulkhead twice. "Clear, clear. Let's get the hell out of here." Voss pulled collective, but the Osprey didn't respond the way it should. The damaged engine was spooling down, losing power. She compensated with the good engine, pushing it past normal limits. The aircraft lurched off the ground, skidding sideways before climbing. Tracers followed them up, a constellation of death reaching into the sky. "Engine 2 is failing," Katsaros said, his voice barely under control. "We're losing oil pressure. We need to land." "Not here," Voss said. Her voice was ice. "We're not landing here." She nursed the Osprey up and over the ridgeline, coaxing altitude out of an airframe that was trying to kill them. The flight controls felt mushy, delayed. Something in the hydraulic system was compromised. Behind them in the cargo bay, a Navy corpsman worked frantically on the wounded, his hands slick with blood. The screaming had stopped, replaced by something worse: silence. The flight back to Bagram took 37 minutes. Voss flew every second of it on the edge of catastrophe, the Osprey vibrating like it was trying to shake itself apart. She transitioned to airplane mode despite the engine damage, because it was the only way to maintain altitude with the power they had left. The good engine screamed in protest, turbine temperature climbing into the red zone. She ignored it. Katsaros called out system failures as they cascaded, hydraulic pressure dropping, electrical bus offline, fuel transfer pump malfunction. Voss acknowledged each one with a single word and kept flying. Her hands on the controls were steady, her breathing even. In the back of her mind, in that quiet place where she'd learned to live, she was already flying the emergency landing, already calculating where to put the aircraft if everything failed at once. But it didn't fail, not completely. The Osprey held together through sheer force of will, hers and the machine's, and when the lights of Bagram appeared on the horizon, Voss allowed herself a single deep breath, just one. Then she called the tower, her voice professional and calm. "Bagram Tower, Yukon 13, emergency inbound. Single engine, multiple systems degraded. Request priority handling and medical on the ramp." They rolled out fire trucks and ambulances, the whole emergency response package. Voss brought the Osprey in on a long, shallow approach, bleeding off speed gradually because she didn't trust the aircraft to do anything quickly. The landing was firm but controlled. When the wheels touched down and the Osprey finally stopped moving, Katsaros let out a breath he'd been holding for 30 minutes. Voss shut down the remaining engine and sat in the silence that followed, listening to the airframe tick and groan as it cooled. Behind her, medics were already swarming the cargo bay, triaging the wounded. She pulled off her helmet, ran a hand through sweat-soaked hair, and climbed out of the cockpit. The night air hit her like a wall, hot and thick with dust. She walked around the Osprey, inspecting the damage by flashlight. Dozens of bullet holes perforated the fuselage. The tail boom was shredded. The #2 engine was trailing oil across the concrete. It was a miracle they'd made it back at all. Briggs found her there, standing alone in the wash of floodlights. He looked at the aircraft, then at her. Hell of a piece of flying, Yukon. She nodded once, non-committal. The crew did their jobs. Ramos kept the enemy suppressed. Katsaros managed systems. Yeah, well, Briggs folded his arms. Ironclad says you flew into a 3-sided ambush without air support and pulled them out anyway. Says you saved 14 lives tonight. That's going in my report. Voss didn't respond. She was watching the medics carry a stretcher toward a waiting ambulance. The Marine with no leg. He was conscious now, talking to the corpsman. He'd live. Briggs cleared his throat. Get some rest. You've got a debrief at 800. She walked back to her quarters in the dark, alone, the way she preferred it. Nobody stopped her. Nobody asked if she was okay. That was fine. She wouldn't have known how to answer anyway. Inside her small plywood room, she peeled off her flight suit and body armor and sat on the edge of her bunk in her underwear and a tan t-shirt, staring at nothing. Her hands were shaking now, the adrenaline finally catching up. She pressed them flat against her thighs until they stilled. On the wall above her desk was a single photograph, a younger version of herself standing next to a Cessna 172 in front of a hangar in Fairbanks. Snow everywhere, mountains in the background. She'd been 17 in that picture, skinny and bright-eyed, convinced that flying would be her ticket out of the dark. She'd been right, in a way, but the dark had followed her anyway. She lay back and closed her eyes, but she didn't sleep. She never did after missions like this. Instead, she ran through the flight in her mind, analyzing every decision, every input, looking for the mistakes she'd made, the places where she'd gotten lucky instead of being good. That's how you stayed alive. That's how you kept other people alive. You didn't celebrate, you learned. Outside, the war continued. Somewhere in the Hindu Kush, men with guns were planning the next ambush, the next attack. And when it came, someone would call and she'd spin up the Osprey and fly into the dark again, because that's what she did. That's all she'd ever done. The quiet Alaska girl who'd learned to survive the winter, who'd learned that the only person you could really count on was yourself, who'd walked away from a burning helicopter once before and knew she could do it again if she had to. They didn't understand her, the men she flew with. They never would. And that was fine, too. She didn't need them to understand. She just needed them to trust her when it mattered. And tonight they had. 3 days later, Catherine Voss was back in the rotation, flying supplies into forward operating bases along the Pakistan border. The Osprey she'd brought back shot to hell had been cannibalized for parts. Her new bird was older, with more hours on the airframe, but it flew clean. That was all she cared about. Katsaros was different now. He didn't talk as much, didn't try to fill the silence with nervous chatter. He'd seen what it looked like when things went wrong, and he'd seen what it took to bring everyone home anyway. He watched her during pre-flight, studying the way she moved, the way she checked and double-checked everything. Learning. Ramos was Ramos, unshakable. He'd been in country for 9 months and had another 3 to go. He'd seen worse than the Korangal, and he'd see worse again before his deployment ended. But he'd started calling her boss instead of ma'am, and in the crew chief world that meant something. The story of the rescue spread through the aviation community the way all stories do, exaggerated, compressed, mythologized. By the time it reached the other squadrons, Voss had supposedly flown through a wall of rocket fire, landed on the side of a cliff, and single-handedly held off 50 Taliban fighters while loading casualties. None of it was true, but she didn't bother correcting anyone. Let them tell whatever version they wanted. She had work to do. But the Marines she'd pulled out of the Korangal remembered the truth. They remembered the sound of the Osprey's rotors cutting through the darkness when they thought they were going to die on that ridgeline. They remembered the calm voice on the radio, giving instructions, coordinating the extraction without a trace of panic. They remembered the way the aircraft had absorbed hits and kept flying, and the way it had somehow made it back to base when by all rights it should have crashed in the mountains. Ironclad, the downed pilot, found her in the Chow Hall a week later. He was a captain, tall and broad-shouldered, with a bandage wrapped around his head and stitches closing a cut above his eye. He carried his tray over and sat down across from her without asking. "Yukon," he said. She looked up from her food, ironclad. "I wanted to say thanks, properly, for coming to get us." She nodded, went back to eating. Conversation wasn't her strength. He leaned forward. "You know they're writing you up for a DFC, right? Distinguished Flying Cross. Briggs pushed it through, says it's the least you deserve." Voss shrugged. Medals didn't mean much to her. She already had one she never looked at. Ironclad studied her for a moment. "Why'd you do it? Fly into that mess? You could have waved off. Nobody would have blamed you." She was quiet for a long time, chewing, thinking. "Then, you would have done the same." "Maybe," he smiled, but there was something sad in it. "But I would have been scared shitless the whole time. You looked like you were flying a training sortie." "I was scared," she said softly. "I'm always scared." That surprised him. He'd been expecting bravado, the usual pilot swagger, but there was none of that in her voice, just honesty. "Then how do you do it?" he asked. She met his eyes. "You don't think about what might happen. You think about what needs to happen, and then you make it happen." He nodded slowly, like he was filing that away for later. "Well, for what it's worth, those Marines are alive because of you. 6 of them wouldn't have made it without that extraction. So, thanks." She didn't know what to say to that, so she just nodded. He finished his meal in silence and left, and she went back to eating alone. That night she lay in her bunk staring at the plywood ceiling, thinking about what Ironclad had said. 6 lives. Was that true? Maybe, maybe not. The corpsmen had done most of the real work, keeping them stable during the flight. Ramos had suppressed the enemy fire. Katsaros had managed the systems. She'd just flown the airplane, that's all it was. Flying. But she thought about the Marine with no leg, the one who'd been conscious when they loaded him. She thought about how he'd looked at her when they were unloading at Bagram, his face pale but his eyes clear. He hadn't said anything, but she'd seen something there. Recognition, maybe. Gratitude. She rolled over, closed her eyes, and tried to sleep. The weeks blurred together after that, one mission bleeding into the next. She flew resupply runs, medevacs, troop insertions. She flew in dust storms that turned the sky orange and reduced visibility to 0. She flew in weather that grounded every other aircraft on the flight line. She flew because that's what they needed her to do, and she was good at it. The other pilots started watching her differently, not with the casual dismissal they'd had before, but with something else. Curiosity, maybe, respect. They asked her opinion in briefings. They studied her approach plates, her flight planning. They noticed that she never complained, never made excuses, never blamed equipment or weather or luck. She just flew. But nobody really knew her. Not the way they knew each other. She didn't drink with them at the makeshift bar on base. She didn't join the poker games or the endless bullshit sessions in the ready room. She kept to herself, reading paperback novels in her quarters or running laps around the perimeter fence in the Afghan heat. Ramos understood in his way. He'd grown up poor in El Paso, the oldest of 6 kids, and he'd learned young that survival meant keeping your head down and your mouth shut. He recognized that quality in Voss, the self-sufficiency that came from being raised in a place where help wasn't coming. They didn't talk about it, but they didn't have to. Katsaros, on the other hand, came from money. His father was a defense contractor, his mother a lawyer. He'd grown up in Virginia with every advantage, and he'd joined the Marines because he wanted to prove something to himself. He was smart and capable, but he'd never known real hardship, and it showed. He watched Voss the way an apprentice watches a master trying to decode the alchemy of competence. One afternoon, after a long mission inserting a SEAL team into the mountains near Jalalabad, Katsaros worked up the courage to ask. They were doing post-flight, and Voss was on her knees checking the landing gear for damage. "Can I ask you something, ma'am?" "Sure." "Where'd you learn to fly like that? I mean, I went through the same flight school as you, same training, but you're different, better. I'm trying to figure out what I'm missing." She stood, wiped her hands on a rag. "How much time you got?" "Flying, about 300 hours. "I've got 4,000. She said it matter-of-factly, without pride or boast. "Most of it in helicopters, in shit conditions. Alaska mostly. Bush flying before I enlisted. You learn quick when the weather's trying to kill you and the nearest help is 200 miles away." Katsaros nodded slowly. "So it's just experience." "Experience," she agreed. "And understanding that the airplane doesn't care about your rank or your feelings. It responds to inputs. You give it the right inputs at the right time, it does what you need. You don't, it kills you. That's all flying is. Cause and effect." He thought about that. "What made you join the Marines, if you were already flying in Alaska?" She was quiet for a moment, her eyes distant. Seemed like the thing to do. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was all she was willing to share. The real reason, the silence of her childhood, the weight of growing up in a place where the horizon never changed, the need to escape into a sky bigger than the one over Fairbanks, that was hers alone. 2 months into the deployment, Voss flew her 50th combat mission. There was no ceremony, no celebration, just another line in her logbook. 50 times she'd flown into contested airspace, 50 times she'd come back. The odds were against her eventually, and she knew it. Everybody did. You could only roll the dice so many times before you came up snake eyes. But she didn't think about that. Thinking about dying was like thinking about the cold when you were already freezing. It didn't help. You just kept moving, kept flying, kept trusting your training and your instincts until one day you didn't have to anymore. The Distinguished Flying Cross came through in late August. They pinned it on her chest during a formation on the flight line, with the whole squadron standing at attention in the heat. The base commander said some words about valor and dedication. Voss stood straight, eyes forward, feeling nothing. Afterwards, Briggs pulled her aside. "You know why I pushed for this?" "No, sir." "Because in 20 years of doing this job, I've never seen anyone fly the way you do. You're not flashy, you're not fast, but you're smart and you're steady and you get people home. That's what matters." He paused. "I'm putting you in for a medal upgrade, Navy Cross." She blinked. "Sir, that's not." "It's not my call, it's the Pentagon's. But it's going up the chain. What you did in the Korangal meets the criteria. You engaged the enemy under fire at great personal risk and saved 14 lives. That's the definition of extraordinary heroism." Voss didn't know what to say. The Navy Cross was the second highest military decoration, one step below the Medal of Honor. People who earned it were legends. People like her father, who died in Desert Storm before she was old enough to remember him. He had one in a shadow box somewhere, along with a folded flag and a photograph of a man she'd never known. "I don't deserve that, sir." "You don't get to decide that," Briggs said firmly. "I do, and I already have." The war ground on, indifferent to medals and speeches. Voss kept flying. September bled into October and the weather started to turn. The heat broke, replaced by cold winds that came down from the mountains at night. The enemy adapted, as they always did, using the terrain and the season to their advantage. Voss adapted too. She studied the weather patterns, learned to read the winds. She memorized the terrain in every sector, every valley and ridgeline. She became the pilot commanders requested by name when the mission was critical, when failure wasn't an option. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the other pilots stopped calling her Yukon. They started calling her boss like Ramos did, or sometimes just Voss, with a tone of respect that hadn't been there before. She'd earned her place not through bravado or flash, but through consistency, through showing up, through being the one they could count on. She didn't notice the change at first. She was too focused on the next mission, the next flight. But one day, sitting in the ready room before a briefing, she heard two new pilots talking, fresh from the States, barely in country a week. "That her?" one whispered, nodding toward Voss. "Yeah, that's Voss, the one who flew into the Koringal. She doesn't look like much." The other pilot, slightly older, shook his head. "Doesn't matter what she looks like. When the shit hits the fan, she's the one you want flying, trust me." Voss heard it and said nothing. She opened her mission folder and started reading as if the conversation hadn't happened. But inside, in that quiet place, something shifted. Not pride exactly, more like recognition. She'd spent her whole life being underestimated, dismissed. The quiet Alaska girl, the one who didn't fit. And she'd learned to use that to let people think she was less than she was because it meant they left her alone. But maybe, for the first time, that was changing. In November, the Koringal Valley erupted again. A Chinook carrying a Special Forces team was shot down during an insertion, and the entire valley turned into a killing field. Apache gunships circled overhead, raining Hellfire missiles into suspected enemy positions. A-10 Warthogs strafed the ridgelines with their 30 cannons, and in the middle of it all, someone had to go in and get the survivors out. Briggs didn't even ask. He found Voss in the maintenance hangar, inspecting a replacement hydraulic pump, and said 3 words, "We need you." She nodded, wiped her hands, and walked to the flight line. Ramos and Katsaros were already there, prepping the Osprey. They'd heard the call and knew what it meant. Nobody said anything about the danger, about the odds. They just worked. 20 minutes later, Voss lifted off into a sky choked with smoke and dust. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting everything in shades of orange and red, beautiful in a way, if you ignored what was happening below. The flight to the Koringal took 18 minutes. As they approached, the radio came alive with voices, ground units calling for fire support, Apache pilots coordinating gun runs, the downed Special Forces team requesting immediate extraction. It was chaos, the kind that got people killed. Voss listened to it all, filtering the noise for the information that mattered. Enemy positions, friendly locations, LZ conditions. She built a picture in her mind, turning the chaos into data, the data into a plan. "Yukon, this is Blade 26, the Special Forces team leader called. His voice was calm, professional, but Voss could hear the strain underneath. "We're pinned down on the south slope. Heavy contact from multiple directions. 2 critical casualties. We need immediate dust-off." "Copy, Blade 26. Inbound 2 minutes. Stand by for gun run." She brought the Osprey in low and fast, using the terrain for cover. The valley walls rose on either side, so close she could see individual rocks and trees. Tracers filled the air ahead, a curtain of fire that seemed impenetrable. But Voss had done this before. She knew that fire looked denser than it was, that there were always gaps, always a way through if you were willing to find it. Ramos opened up with the door gun, suppressing enemy positions. Katsaros called out threats, his voice steady now, no trace of the panic from months before. And Voss flew, her hands and feet working the controls with a fluidity that came from thousands of hours of practice, from muscle memory so deep it was almost instinct. The LZ was worse than the last time. No flat ground, just a boulder-strewn slope with barely enough room for the Osprey's footprint. Enemy fire intensified as they descended, converging on the aircraft from 3 directions. Rounds punched through the fuselage, shattering instruments, severing hydraulic lines. A warning light illuminated, fire in the cargo bay. Fire, Ramos shouted. We've got a fire back here. Voss didn't abort. She held the descent, eyes locked on the slope below. At the last second she flared hard and the Osprey slammed onto the ground with a crunch that buckled a landing strut. Load 'em up, she barked. 30 seconds. The Special Forces team materialized out of the smoke, dragging their wounded. They moved with the efficiency of men who'd trained for this exact scenario 1,000 times. 1 minute they were ghosts in the haze, the next they were in the cargo bay, securing the casualties. But as the last man climbed aboard, an RPG streaked out of the darkness and detonated against the Osprey's tail rotor. The explosion was deafening, and the aircraft lurched sideways. Voss fought the controls, trying to stabilize, but the damage was catastrophic. The tail rotor was gone, and with it, any ability to control yaw. "We're hit bad," Katsaros yelled. "Tail rotors destroyed." Voss didn't respond. She was already compensating, using differential thrust between the engines to counter the torque. It was a technique she'd learned flying helicopters in Alaska, a trick that only worked if you were good and if you were lucky. She was good. Whether she was lucky remained to be seen. She pulled power, and the Osprey clawed its way off the slope, spinning slowly but climbing. The valley walls closed in on either side, and Voss threaded the needle between them, her eyes flicking between the instruments and the windscreen, calculating angles and speeds faster than conscious thought could process. Behind her, Ramos was fighting the fire with an extinguisher, filling the cargo bay with white foam. The Special Forces medic worked on the casualties, his hands moving with desperate precision. And in the cockpit, Katsaros called out system failures in a voice that was somehow still calm, still professional. "Hydraulics are gone, flight controls are degraded, electrical system is failing. Ma'am, we need to land." "Not yet," Voss said. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the noise like a blade. "Not yet." She nursed the dying Osprey,